My son mocked the green tie I was wearing right in front of everyone at his mother's funeral. 34 years at that hospital, and this cheap rag is the best you can manage. He walked away smiling, thinking I was just a broken and exhausted maintenance worker. He thought he was certain of his inheritance and would take over my house without any resistance. What he didn't know was that my late wife had spent over 30 years secretly building an $11.4 million fortress to protect me, and the trap she left behind. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know what country or city are you watching from. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is entirely coincidental, but the lessons inside are worth keeping. The morning we buried Evelyn, I wore the olive green tie she had knotted around my collar 11 years before. The same hands, the same silk, the same quiet love. I thought it was the right thing to do. I was wrong about what would happen next. Mill Haven Funeral Home sat on the corner of Elm and 3rd, a building I had driven past 1,000 times without ever looking at it too closely. That morning, I looked at everything too closely. The amber light pooling along the baseboards, the white lilies arranged in threes beside the photograph on the memorial table, the snow coming down outside in small, drifting pieces, the kind that never quite sticks, but never quite stops either. Midwest December, the sky the color of old dishwater. The air holding its breath like it was waiting for something I hadn't been told about yet. I stood near the table and shook hands. That was the job. That was the only thing I knew how to do with my hands when they had nothing left to hold. I thank you for coming. I said it over and over until the words stopped sounding like words. A woman named Patricia, Evelyn's colleague from the cardiac unit for 12 years, gripped my hand with both of hers and didn't say anything at all. She just held on for a moment longer than was necessary, her eyes red at the rims. I was grateful for that. The ones who cried made it easier somehow. Their grief was plainly worn, openly carried, and that gave me permission to keep standing upright. There were more people than I expected. Hospital staff in their Sunday clothes, former patients I had never met, men and women who stopped to tell me that Evelyn had sat with them in the dark hours before surgery had called them by name when no one else remembered their names, had held their hands when their own families were still searching for parking. 31 years in that cardiac unit. I knew the number, but standing there, listening to strangers describe the woman I had slept beside for 4 decades, I began to understand it differently. She had built something in that hospital that outlasted every shift, every chart, every protocol. She had built herself into other people's lives quietly, without asking permission, without keeping score. I was in the middle of thanking a man whose name I never caught when the door at the far end of the room opened. Brandon Sutton, my son. My only child was 39 years old and had not arrived early to anything in at least a decade. He was 20 minutes late to his mother's funeral. He wore a charcoal suit over a dark dress shirt, the fabric cut close, the kind of suit that costs enough to announce something. A watch I didn't recognize caught the light along his wrist, silver, heavy-looking new. He paused at the entrance, eyes moving across the full room in a single controlled sweep. They did not stop at Evelyn's photograph. They did not stop at the flowers. They found me, and they stopped there. Sandra was beside him, Brandon's wife, 37, with the kind of composed expression that fits perfectly into any room without ever quite belonging to it. She carried a designer bag over one arm. Her nails were done in pale beige. Her eyes were dry. I noticed that the way you notice weather without judgment, just with a quiet, settling awareness that tells you what kind of day it's going to be. Brandon crossed the room without pausing. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't look at the photograph. He didn't say her name. He stopped directly in front of me, looked down at the tie, and spoke loudly enough that the 4 or 5 people standing nearest to us heard every single word. Dad, is that the same tie from my wedding? You couldn't find anything better for Mom's funeral. Something died in my chest, quietly, the way a pilot light goes out when you don't realize the gas has been off for hours. I started to explain. I told him Evelyn had chosen this tie, found it in a shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon in 2013. Held it up against my collar and told me I looked like the man she'd fallen in love with all over again. I told him she had knotted it herself, standing behind me at the dressing room mirror before the ceremony at Mill Haven Grand Ballroom. I told him I wore it today because I wanted her close, because it was the closest thing I had. He cut me off before I finished. "She's gone, Dad. She can't see what you're wearing anymore." The murmur that moved through the room was small, just a ripple, but I felt it the way you feel a cold draft from a room you cannot locate, sudden, sourceless, impossible to shake. Sandra looked at the floor, not from shame. I had known Sandra long enough to understand her silences. She simply did not want to be associated with the moment. Brandon lowered his voice, but only slightly. 34 years at that hospital, and this is the best you can manage. Someone near him. I didn't see who let out a soft, brief sound of amusement. Evelyn's colleagues stood less than 5 feet away. They had heard everything. Not one of them moved. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I looked down at the tie, olive green silk worn at the knot from years of careful use. Then I looked up at the mirror mounted on the wall and saw a 61-year-old man with silver hair and a mechanic's hands, his shoulders beginning very slowly against every instinct to bend. Is this really all I am? Brandon had already turned away. He was across the room now, shaking hands with someone I didn't recognize, wearing the clean, effortless smile of a man who has never once had to apologize for anything in public. I bent down to retrieve the funeral program that had slipped from my fingers somewhere in the middle of all of it. My hand was trembling. I straightened up and looked at Evelyn's photograph, the one from the summer before the diagnosis, her hair down the light falling across it from the left. Her smile exactly as I had always known it and would know it past the last moment of my own life. I pressed the program flat against my chest, and I stood as straight as I could manage. She had told me 3 days before she left, "Don't let them make you feel small, Gerald." I hadn't understood then why she said it with such certainty. As if she already knew exactly what was coming. As if she had been preparing for this moment long before I had any reason to. By the time I got home that night, the snow had covered the front walk completely. I didn't shovel it. I just stood at the door for a moment, key in my hand, unable to remember the last time I had come home to a house where no one was waiting. The answer, I realized it slowly standing there in the cold, was never. In 39 years at this address, it had never happened before tonight. I unlocked the door. The house was exactly as I had left it that morning. Evelyn's winter coat hung on the hook in the hallway. Her reading glasses folded on top of the paperback on the arm of the sofa. A dish towel draped over the kitchen faucet where she always left it. Everything exactly in its place. Everything entirely, irreversibly wrong. The first thing I did when I came inside was take off the olive green tie. I did it the way she had always done it, loosened the knot, slowly drew the silk through without creasing it, folded it in thirds and set it on the kitchen table before I set down my keys, before I took off my coat, before anything else. I didn't reach for the overhead light. 40 years of Evelyn's voice. "Gerald, that light makes your eyes forget how to rest," had settled something permanently into my instincts, and my hand went to the small lamp above the stove without any deliberate decision being made. It put out an amber glow that reached just far enough to make out the edges of the room and no farther. The only light that had ever felt right in that kitchen. I moved to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the way I had moved to it every evening for nearly 4 decades, automatically, thoughtlessly. The way you move toward things that have been true so long, they no longer require intention. My fingers found the china set white porcelain with a thin blue border, 12 pieces purchased by Evelyn at a church charity fair in 1991. She had carried it home in newspaper wrapping, set it on the counter, and announced with great satisfaction that anything too pretty not to use every day ought to be used every day. And so, we had 33 years of morning coffee, evening tea, slow Saturday breakfasts. I had washed each piece by hand every single night since we first unpacked it. I reached for 2 cups before I understood what I was doing. I stood there with one in each hand, then I placed the second one back on the shelf, slowly, carefully. The way you set something down when you sense that moving too fast might shatter something you don't yet have a name for. I made 1 cup of tea and sat down. Across the table, Evelyn's chair was empty. The cushion still held the faint, precise impression of her, the particular way she had always settled in slightly to the left, feet tucked beneath her when the nights turned cold. I had never had reason to notice that impression as an absence before. Tonight it was the most specific thing in the room, the most fully present. I thought about the house. In 1992, Millhaven General gave me an unexpected raise. I was head of building maintenance, not a surgeon, not an administrator, but the man who kept the boilers running and the wiring honest and the lights burning for the people doing the real life and death work. The raise was meaningful, and I spent several weeks reading listings in the Sunday paper, quietly asking myself whether we ought to be somewhere bigger. One evening, I sat at this exact table and put the question to Evelyn directly. Should we move somewhere bigger? She looked around the kitchen at the curtains she had sewn and hung herself. At the windows, whose sills she had painted one August weekend at the house, we had made the very last mortgage payment on just 4 months before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What for? We have everything we need right here. Let's put the difference somewhere useful." I didn't ask what useful meant. With Evelyn, that question was almost always unnecessary. She had already thought it through, and what she was offering me was the chance to trust her rather than make her explain. I had come to understand across our years together that this was a particular form of generosity on her part. I nodded. We stayed. I thought no more about it. I had thought very little about it since, until tonight. I opened the drawer beside the stove, looking for the honey I had always taken evening tea with a single spoon of it. And Evelyn had always kept it in that drawer because I could never find it in the cabinet on my own. What I found instead, at the very back of the drawer behind rubber bands and spare batteries and twist ties she had saved from bread bags, was a small torn scrap of paper in her handwriting. Small, slanting slightly to the right, the way it always had. Buy more honey, G. You always forget. No date. It could have been written last month or 3 years ago. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the breast pocket of my vest, which I noticed only then, still wearing. I had not thought to change. I was still dressed for her funeral. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. Brandon. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. You okay?" Behind him, I could hear the quiet, steady rhythm of a keyboard, the sound of someone working through a list of things that needed to be managed before the end of the night. "I'm fine, son." Good. Let me know if you need anything. Sandra sends her love." 4 minutes beginning to end. He didn't mention the tie. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask whether I'd eaten, or whether I'd managed to sleep the night before, or whether there was anything in the house worth calling dinner. When the silence between us stretched one beat too long, I said goodnight and hung up before either of us had to reach for something real to fill it with. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. I did not want to go upstairs. The bedroom was going to be emptier than this room, and this room was already more than I knew how to hold. So I sat in my chair with one hand resting on the folded tie on the table beside me, and I turned over in my mind what Evelyn had said 3 days before she left. Don't let them make you feel small. Gerald. I still couldn't locate the certainty in it, that quiet, settled weight. The sound of someone who already knows exactly what is waiting on the other side of a door they have not yet walked through. I sat in that dark kitchen until past midnight. I didn't know it then, but 12 days later, a man I had never met would ring my doorbell and change everything I thought I knew about the woman I had spent my entire life loving. A week after the funeral, I found the wedding album in the bottom drawer of the living room cabinet, the one Evelyn always kept locked with a small brass key she wore on her keychain. I had found the keychain 2 days before, in the small envelope the hospital sent back with her personal effects. I don't know why I opened the album that morning. Maybe I was looking for something. Maybe I was trying to remember when things started going wrong. The living room was quiet in that particular way, of winter mornings, pale light coming through the curtains. Evelyn had never gotten around to replacing, the house holding the kind of still that makes every small sound into something deliberate. I sat on the sofa with the album across my lap and turned to the first page slowly, the way you open something you know you're not quite ready for. The photograph that stopped me was not from the ceremony. It had been taken in the dressing room 40 minutes before the processional began. Evelyn stood behind me at the mirror, the olive green tie in her hands, her fingers working the knot with the easy precision of someone who had done it 100 times before. She was looking directly into the camera over my shoulder, not at the lens exactly, but through it the way she looked at things she had already made her mind up about. Her smile was the particular kind she kept for moments she had chosen to be in, fully and without reservation. When she finished the knot, she smoothed both hands flat against my lapels and said, "You look like the man I fell in love with all over again." Brandon was in the doorway behind her, already in his white tuxedo jacket, laughing at something openly, completely, with his whole face the way a man laughs on the day he is happiest. That was the Brandon I wanted to remember. I made a point of it sitting there, in the pale December light. I held that image deliberately, the open laugh, the doorway, the June brightness coming in behind him, because it was true, and because truth does not stop being true simply because something else becomes true later. I turned back several pages to a photograph tucked inside the front cover, Thanksgiving 2013. It had been Brandon's idea to bring Sandra to meet us before the holiday ended. She arrived in a cream-colored cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back carrying a bottle of wine she had clearly selected with some care. She said exactly the right things. She complimented the house. She asked Evelyn about nursing with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. She called me Sir once, which I told her was entirely unnecessary. She was lovely, she was perfectly composed, and she was doing something with her eyes between the right things. She was saying that I noticed, but could not quite name at the time, a quiet, deliberate survey of the room that moved from the shelves to the furniture to the small, unassuming details of a house that had been lived in honestly for 30 years without renovation or apology. After dinner, after Brandon and Sandra had settled in the living room, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while Evelyn dried them beside me. She was quiet in the way she got quiet when she was settling something in her own mind, not uncomfortable, just internal. Then, without turning to look at me, she said, "She's counting Gerald." I handed her a bowl. Counting what? Evelyn took the bowl and dried it in 2 slow, deliberate circles and set it on the counter. She didn't answer. 31 years as a cardiac care nurse had given Evelyn a particular kind of perception I had always respected more than I could articulate. 3 decades of reading people through what they chose to say in order to understand what they had decided not to. She knew the difference between a patient who was recovering and one who had simply gotten more disciplined about hiding. She did not make observations without reason. She also did not always choose to make them out loud. She handed me the dish towel instead. Later that evening over decaf, Brandon mentioned his new position at Crestwood Capital Investment Portfolio Management, a title that took several sentences to fully explain. He described the compensation as significantly higher than most people in this town will ever see. And he said it the way people say certain things when there is someone specific they want to hear it. I looked at my son across the table. He was looking back at me, not with the pride that moves toward a person, but the kind that measures. I recognized it the way you recognize a sound you have never heard before, but somehow already know. I turned more pages. Near the middle of the album, Evelyn had tucked in a small photograph, out of chronological order, the way she sometimes did a photograph of Brandon at 7 years old, standing with his bicycle in front of the house. He had come off that bike at the raised seam of concrete at the end of our front walk, the one I had meant to level for years and never gotten to. I saw it happen from the kitchen window. I set down my sandwich and went outside, and sat down on the sidewalk next to him. The knee was bleeding through the denim. All I had in my pocket was the linen handkerchief Evelyn had given me the Christmas before, my initials embroidered in the corner in blue thread. I pressed it carefully against the cut and held it there. After a while, he stopped crying. After a while longer, he stopped shaking. He looked up at me and said, "Dad, you always make it stop hurting." I had not promised him anything. I had not said a word. I had simply sat down on the concrete and stayed there until it was over. I sat with that for a long time. The boy who had said that to me and the man who had spoken loud enough for strangers to hear in the funeral home 7 days ago were the same person. I understood that. I was not angry about it. Sitting in the pale winter light with the album on my knees, I was simply aware of a second loss running parallel beneath the first, different in its shape but not in its gravity. The kind of loss that does not arrive all at once. The kind that has been sitting quietly across from you for years, saying nothing, waiting to be named. I put the album away and sat very still. Evelyn had seen something in Sandra that first Thanksgiving, something she never said out loud to me. But I was beginning to understand that Evelyn rarely said out loud the things that mattered most. She wrote them down instead. And somewhere in this house, she had left me something to find. On the 10th day after we buried Evelyn, I finally found the courage to go through her nightstand. I told myself I was looking for her reading glasses to give to Dorothy next door. The truth was, I needed to be near her things, near the small, ordinary objects that still held the shape of her hands. The bedroom was exactly as she had left it. The curtains were drawn the way she liked them. In the afternoon, not fully closed, just enough to soften the light without losing it altogether. The reading lamp on her side of the bed still had a slight tilt to the shade she had never wanted fixed. I moved around the room, slowly opening drawers without taking anything out. The way you look at things you're not ready to decide about. Her nightstand drawer was last. I slid it open and stood for a moment without reaching in. A half-empty bottle of the mild sleep aid her doctor had prescribed in October, her reading glasses folded. The paperback she had been working through, a mystery set in coastal Maine, still open face down at page 247, the spine creased at the exact angle of her wrist. A small packet of tissues, the kind she kept in every room. And beneath all of it, folded once a slip of paper in her handwriting. Thomas Hale, 31729300044. He knows what to do. I didn't recognize the name. I read it twice, set the slip on the bed beside me, and looked back into the drawer as if something else might materialize. Then I understood what was actually missing, the brown notebook. The one Evelyn had written in at the kitchen table for as long as I could reliably remember, a plain composition book with a dark cover, the kind that costs almost nothing at a drugstore. It was not in the nightstand, not in the dresser I had just gone through, not on the shelf above the closet rod. She had taken it somewhere before she went into the hospital. I hadn't noticed at the time because there had been nothing to notice. Now, standing in the middle of the room, she would not walk back into I did. I sat down on the edge of the bed. What I remembered first was a summer evening in 2010. Brandon had come by without calling ahead, not unusual for him then, and settled at the kitchen table the way he still did in those years, without needing a reason. He was 24, working his first real corporate job, with an energy I recognized as ambition in the early stages before it has learned how to wait. He had an idea, an investment opportunity. He had already looked into it thoroughly, he said. He had numbers. The first conversation was easy, an introduction casually delivered. We listened and told him we'd think about it. The second time, he brought printed pages charts, projected returns, a cover sheet with a logo I didn't recognize. "It's a sure thing, Mom," he said. "I just need some backing from people I trust." The third time, I was in the garage when it began. When I came in through the kitchen door, Brandon was looking at Evelyn in a way I had not seen before, or not understood before. He was looking at her the way you look at a problem you are actively working through. Not a mother, a resource. Evelyn said very calmly, "We're not in a position to help with that right now, Brandon." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply went quiet in the particular way that isn't acceptance, the kind that files something away and moves on. He was cooler after that. Not dramatically. Just the small, precise recalibrations of someone who has updated a number and is acting on the new figure. That night after he left, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the brown notebook open in front of her. I had seen her do this before, but that evening she stayed later than usual, past 10, past 11. I came downstairs for water, and she was still at the table writing steadily in the small circle of lamplight. "What are you writing, Evie?" She looked up and offered me the particular smile she kept for when she was giving me something small in place of something larger. "Nursing notes from today's shift. Old habit." I didn't question it. I went back upstairs, and she gave me that same answer in those same 4 words for every evening I thought to ask in the years that followed. I thought about Brandon at 12, the memory arriving without warning, the way the real ones do. I had been looking at the wedding photograph on the wall, the one where we are both young enough to look like different people entirely, both laughing at something neither of us could recall anymore. He had failed a math exam and dreaded coming home. His teacher had called. I met him on the front step before he reached the door, and I could see it on his face, the specific misery of a child who has decided a single bad grade is a permanent verdict. I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and said, "Show me where you got lost. We'll find our way back together." We worked until nearly 11 o'clock. Fractions, equations, the precise point in the sequence where the logic had come loose. At some point, Evelyn appeared from the hallway and set 2 mugs of warm milk on the table without a word and left again. Brandon didn't notice. He was already somewhere in the problem. By the end of it, he was working them cleanly and correctly. The 2021 memory arrived next, quieter but sharper. A Saturday afternoon, Brandon and Sandra had driven up from the city without warning. I was in the garage when I heard Sandra's voice in the driveway and stayed at the workbench, glad to have something to finish. Evelyn had been at the kitchen table. She had left the back door open because the afternoon was still mild. Brandon came around the side of the house and stepped in through the screen door without knocking. "Hey, Mom, that garage door is..." and stopped. Evelyn closed the brown notebook in one motion. Not quickly enough to look alarmed, but quickly enough. She was not a woman who startled easily. That was the thing that registered. "Brandon, I didn't hear you come in. Your father's in the garage." Brandon looked at the closed notebook on the table, then at her. Then the easy smile came back. "Sorry for barging in." She stood, picked up the notebook, and walked it into the hallway. They did not mention it again, but he had seen it. And I understood now, sitting in the afternoon quiet of her bedroom 10 days after her funeral, that he had not forgotten that some part of him had been keeping careful track of that brown notebook from that particular Saturday forward. I picked up the slip of paper from the bed. I looked up at the wedding photograph on the wall, Evelyn at 27, the two of us on the steps of the church on Carver Street laughing at something just outside the frame. She had not known then what was coming, neither had I, but she had made sure in the quiet and deliberate way she did most things, that whatever was coming would not arrive without something already in place to meet it. Thomas Hale. I turned the name over in my mind all evening. Evelyn had written it down deliberately, hidden it carefully, placed it exactly where she knew I would eventually look. She had wanted me to call. The question was what she had wanted me to know when I did. On the 12th morning after we buried Evelyn, I called the number she had left for me. The man who answered said he had been expecting my call. That was the first thing that surprised me. He arrived at my door 2 hours later with a leather briefcase and the careful expression of someone carrying news they know will change things. His name was Thomas Hale. He was 38 years old, with wire-framed glasses and a navy suit that fit him precisely the kind of person who attends to details because his work requires him to get them exactly right. He shook my hand at the door and said, "Mr. Sutton, I'm very sorry for your loss. Evelyn spoke of you often." He said it the way people say things when they actually mean them, not as a courtesy attached to the occasion. I let him in. He set his briefcase on the coffee table, opened it with practiced efficiency, and laid a substantial folder of documents beside it. Then he sat across from me, laced his hands, and began. "I've been Evelyn's estate attorney since 2015, he said. "She came to me about a year after Brandon and Sandra's wedding. She didn't explain her reasons in detail, not at first. But she was very clear about what she wanted to put in place, and very clear about wanting it done correctly." He paused just long enough to give me room. "The first thing I need you to understand is the legal structure because it matters. Evelyn established a revocable living trust 10 years ago. Everything she owned passed directly to you the moment she died outside of probate entirely. There is nothing to contest in court, nothing to challenge, nothing to delay. It's yours, Gerald, completely and immediately. I had spent 34 years in building maintenance. I understood what it meant when a structure was built correctly, when the load paths were sound and the materials were chosen for duration, not convenience. What Thomas was describing was a structure someone had thought through carefully and built to last. He opened the folder. The first document was a summary for Novatech Systems. In 1994, Evelyn had inherited just under $74,000 from her uncle, a man who had worked in manufacturing for 40 years and died without a wife or children to leave it to. She had used $9,000 of that to purchase shares in a small privately held medical software company based in Cleveland. Novatech went public in 2002. Over the following decade, as the company expanded its hospital data systems into regional health networks, the stock split 3 separate times in 2004, 2008, and 2012. In 2018, a larger healthcare conglomerate acquired Novatech outright. Evelyn's accumulated shares were converted to their cash equivalent and held in the trust account. Value, as of December 2024, $7,400,000. The tax obligations from the 2018 acquisition were handled through the trust's filing, separate from your joint return. Evelyn worked with a CPA on that transition. You signed what she set in front of you, as you always did. I read the number. I read it again. I set the page down on the table and looked at the family photographs on the wall for a moment. Thomas waited. He had clearly done this before. The second document covered a parcel of land Evelyn had purchased for $14,000 in 1994, a rural plot southeast of Millhaven that had since developed into a commercial logistics corridor. In 2009, she sold the western half for $420,000 and reinvested the proceeds into index funds. The remaining eastern parcel had continued to appreciate as warehousing and distribution infrastructure expanded along the county route. Current value of the land, $1,800,000. The third summary was a 30-year investment record. The $51,000 remaining from her original 1994 inheritance moved gradually from bonds into diversified index funds. with small, consistent annual contributions from her nursing salary added and reinvested without interruption across 3 decades. Total approximately $2,200,000. Thomas aligned all 3 summaries in a row across the coffee table. The combined figure was $11,400,000. I sat with that for what felt like a very long time. Outside, the January air was flat and gray against the windows. I was aware of the sofa under me, the particular quiet of a Wednesday morning, in a house that had held 39 years of ordinary life. The number on the table did not look like my life, and yet every line on every page in front of me was written in the careful handwriting of the woman who had been at the center of it. Thomas reached into the briefcase and set something else on the table. The brown notebook. I recognized it immediately, the pale tan cover, the worn corner, where she always rested her thumb, the small crease along the spine from years of regular use. I had watched her close that cover at the kitchen table more times than I could count. And that's her notebook, I said. 31 years of records. Every investment decision, every date, every amount, every calculation documented as she went. She brought it to me herself in September. 5 months after her diagnosis in April, she told me it was the most important document she owned. She asked me to keep it until I could put it in your hands personally. I reached out and rested my hand on the cover. I had sat across the kitchen table from this notebook on thousands of evenings and believed without a single moment of doubt that it contained nursing notes from the day's shift. Thomas placed a single-page form in front of me. This is a limited financial authorization. It allows me to access account information on your behalf, if ever necessary, purely as a protective measure. You don't have to sign it today. I picked up the pen and signed it. I trust Evelyn's judgment, I said. She trusted you? That's sufficient. A question had been forming in the back of my mind since Thomas first opened the folder, one I hadn't known I was holding until now. If Evelyn had managed all of this alongside our shared household finances for 30 years, why had I seen nothing? The answer arrived before I finished asking it. Evelyn had always prepared our taxes. Every April she sat at the kitchen table with the forms spread before her, worked through them with her usual methodical quiet, and set the finished paperwork in front of me with a pen and a single indicated line. I signed where she pointed. I had never read through the documents on my own, not once in 39 years. I had trusted her with the totality that only develops across decades, the kind that doesn't announce itself as trust, and only becomes visible later as something larger. That was not carelessness. That was what a long marriage looks like when it is actually working. Thomas reached into the briefcase a final time and placed 2 envelopes on the table. The first was a standard white envelope. Evelyn's handwriting across the front. For Gerald, read this alone. The second was heavier, sealed more deliberately, with only Thomas's name written on the outside. This one is for me, Thomas said quietly, but only under certain circumstances. She hoped I would never need to open it. He didn't explain further. I didn't ask. I sat holding the first envelope for a long time after Thomas Hale left. Outside, the January wind pushed snow against the kitchen window, the same window Evelyn had stood at every morning for 39 years. I didn't open the letter that night. I held it the way I used to, hold her hand in the dark when she couldn't sleep. Like letting go would mean something I wasn't ready for. I woke up at 4:30 the way I used to when I had early maintenance calls at the hospital. For just a moment, half asleep, I reached across the bed out of 39 years of habit. Then I remembered. I got up, went to the kitchen, made 1 cup of tea, and opened the envelope. 4 pages. Her handwriting, the small leftward slant she developed when her thoughts were running faster than her hand could follow. I smoothed the first page against the table and sat down to read in the thin amber light of the lamp above the stove. She started with 1997, a Tuesday in October, one of the days I had come in for an emergency after an electrical fault, shut down 2 operating suites in the East Wing. By the time the system was restored and the walkthrough was done, it was past 8. I drove home with grease on my forearms and the kind of tired that goes beyond speech. She had kept dinner warm. I had eaten 4 bites before the sofa took me entirely, boots still on. She had come in from the kitchen and found me there. I pulled the blanket over you and sat in the chair for a long time, just watching. And I thought, this man has been giving everything he has every single day, and he has never once asked for anything in return. That was the night I decided I had to protect him. I set the page down. From the kitchen table, I could see the corner of that sofa through the doorway, the same one unchanged in its same position for 30 years. 28 years ago, she had made a decision in that room that I was only now reading about. She hadn't told me. She had simply started. I kept reading. She wrote about her uncle's inheritance in 1994, $74,000, from a man who had worked in manufacturing all his life and left no one closer to pass it to. The money had sat in an account while she thought. Then I had said something at dinner one evening that I had forgotten immediately. I had been describing a group of young engineers installing a record software system in the hospital. Their focus, the way they worked, the concentration of people who believed in what they were building. You said they had the kind of focus that builds something real. You were right. You always saw people clearly, Gerald more clearly than you ever saw yourself. The company was Novatech Systems. She had put $9,000 of the inheritance into it the following month on the basis of something I said over dinner that I no longer remembered saying. Then came Brandon. She wrote about it without drama and without anger. The summer of 2010, 3 visits, the printed projections, the final conversation, the look on his face when she said no. She described it in one sentence and moved forward on the page, which told me precisely what it had cost her to do so. I didn't stop loving him that day, but I started seeing him clearly, and I knew that the moment I told you about this money, you would want to share it with him. Because that is who you are. Gerald, you don't know how to have good things without wanting the people you love to have them too. And I couldn't let him have this. Not until I knew for certain what he would do with it. I read the paragraph twice through. She had been right, and she had known it long before I did. If she had told me in any year after 2010, I would have had that conversation with Brandon within weeks. And I would have told myself that was the right thing to do. She had known exactly what I would have done. She had made a different choice. She wrote about the second reason across pages 3 and 4 in a hand that was slower. The letters more deliberately spaced the way her writing looked when she had thought through every sentence before placing it. I thought about telling you 100 times. The summer of 2019 when we sat on the back porch and you said you wished we could see Ireland someday. I had the words ready, but I stopped because I knew that if I told you about the money, you would wake up every morning knowing I had been managing something this large without you, and I knew it would make you feel like you hadn't done enough. Like the man who fixed the pipes and kept the lights on for 34 years wasn't enough. And Gerald, you were always enough. More than enough. I couldn't let a number on a page take that from you. I had to stop reading. I set the letter on the table and sat with my hands around the teacup, which had gone cold without my noticing. Outside the kitchen window, January was still dark. The neighborhood sealed in New Year's silence. I thought about the back porch in the summer of 2019, the red sky that evening, the ease of it. She had been sitting across from me with those words already in her mouth, and she had held them there to keep me whole. I picked up the final page. I'm sorry I couldn't give you Ireland while I was still here to see your face. That is the one thing I would do differently. Wait 5 months, watch. You'll know exactly what to do. You are not small, Gerald. You never were. You were the most successful man I ever knew, because you never once confused your worth with your wallet. I folded the 4 pages carefully along their original creases. Then I sat up very straight in my chair. It was the first time I had sat straight since the funeral. Not because of the money was still something that lived on paper, a figure that hadn't yet settled into anything I recognized as my own life. It was because she had seen me across 39 years, with a precision and a steadiness I had never managed to apply to myself, and every choice she had made every quiet evening at that kitchen table. Every question she hadn't asked me to explain had been built on that way of seeing. I looked out the window at the snow-covered garden, the rose beds along the back fence, the low concrete border she had painted white and repainted every few years as needed. She had always covered the roses before the first hard freeze. This year, no one had thought to. I stood up and got my coat. I went outside in the January cold to cover Evelyn's rose bushes the way she had shown me once years ago, when I had asked why she bothered. Because they'll come back, she said. You just have to protect them through the hard part. Standing there in the snow, her words folded in my coat pocket, I made her a promise. 5 months. I would wait. And I would watch. 3 weeks into January, Brandon called to invite me for dinner. His voice had a warmth in it I hadn't heard in years, the careful, constructed warmth of someone who has decided to be charming. I recognized it immediately, not because it was genuine, but because Evelyn had described that exact tone to me once sitting at our kitchen table after a particularly difficult family gathering. "Watch for it," she had said. "It always means something is coming." I accepted anyway. I needed to see. Ridgemont Estates was a development I had watched go up, starting around 2017, 40 acres of former farmland southeast of Mill Haven, converted into townhomes and single-family houses with stone veneers on the front facades and two-car garages for the appearance of having arrived somewhere. Brandon and Sandra had bought in 3 years ago. The houses were handsome enough. They had the look of permanence without any of the history that actually produces it. The dining room was formal in the way that requires ongoing effort to maintain a walnut table long enough to seat 12 set tonight for 3, with placemats that match the curtains. 2 large abstract paintings on the walls, the kind purchased by people who want art without the complication of meaning. No family photographs, no photographs of any kind. Brandon met me at the door doing everything right. The handshake with the shoulder grip, his good wine poured into the appropriate glass. Sandra's smile arrived with it, warm and precisely calibrated to the occasion. She took my coat and asked about the drive. The apology came before the food. "Dad, I want to say something about Mom's funeral." Brandon set his glass down and looked at me with the careful expression of a man being sincere. I was under a lot of pressure at work that day. "I'm sorry, I didn't handle it well." The words were correct. The timing was correct. His eyes were aimed in my direction, but resting on a point several inches in front of my face, not on my eyes. I knew the difference. "I know, son," I said. A beat of silence opened between us. He had expected more. I let him wait. Evelyn had taught me by example across 4 decades. That silence is not something you are obligated to fill on someone else's behalf. Sandra moved things along with practiced ease, the ease of someone who had been assigned this part of the evening. "It must be so quiet at the house now," she said. The concern was aimed precisely, especially with the weather. "It is," I said. She asked whether there were things needing attention, maintenance systems repairs that might be too much for one person to stay on top of alone. She did not ask how I was sleeping. She did not ask how I was spending the evenings or whether I had been eating anything worth calling a meal. She asked about the house. I noticed that. Midway through the main course, Sandra said something and then appeared to think better of it. "Given our current position," she stopped, a small shift in posture. Her eyes moved to Brandon for less than a second. What passed between them in that half-second had a prior history. I was not part of a conversation or several conducted before I arrived. Brandon's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the jaw. Then both of them turned back to me in the same motion, and Sandra redirected smoothly towards something else. I picked up my wine glass and held it without drinking. When the plates were cleared and the conversation had found its footing, Brandon leaned back in his chair in the way people lean back when they are about to introduce the subject they came to introduce. "Dad, have you given any thought to your living situation? Long term, I mean." I said I hadn't thought about it. "There are places that aren't what people picture when they think about this kind of thing," he said. "Not nursing homes, nothing like that. More like resort communities, independent living. Every convenience built in. No more worrying about the roof or the furnace or the backyard in February." He described amenities, pool, dining facilities, organized recreation, neighbors in similar situations. "People your age do it by choice, now not out of necessity. It's a quality of life decision." "Is the house bothering you too?" I asked. "We're worried about you," Brandon said. "Not the house." I nodded. We moved on. About 5 minutes later, the house came back. You have to think about what that property is actually worth in today's market. He said it with the clarity of someone who had looked it up. "Clover Lane right now, you're looking at $585 realistically. That's significant, Dad. That's real money sitting in an old foundation instead of working for you." Sandra set her fork down. "Brandon has relationships with some very good financial advisors. People who specialize in exactly this, making sure whatever comes from a sale is structured correctly and actively growing." I looked at my wine. Then I set the glass on the table. "I'll think about it," I said. Brandon's face opened into what was, to any outside observer, a look of genuine relief. Sandra smiled at her plate. The conversation moved to safer ground and stayed there through the rest of the evening. When I declined dessert and got my coat, Brandon walked me to the door and gripped my shoulder the way he had at the start. He told me to drive carefully. He said it had been really good to have me over. For those 10 seconds in the doorway, he sounded exactly like the son who used to sit at my kitchen table without needing a reason. I had noticed the credit card moment before dinner, Brandon sliding it across to the food delivery driver, with a half-second of held breath before the transaction cleared. The exhale afterward was quiet, but I had spent 34 years diagnosing building systems by the sounds they made under stress, and I knew the difference between a man who pays without thinking and a man who pays and waits to see if it goes through. I drove back to Clover Lane and pulled into the driveway. The kitchen light was on. I had left it burning when I went out the way I had started doing since December, so the house would look occupied from the street. But the house was not occupied. The light was doing the best it could with what it had. I sat in my car in front of my own house for a long time that night. What I didn't know was that the dinner I'd just attended was only the opening move. Brandon had more planned, and the next one. He wouldn't be waiting for an invitation. I had been trying to learn how to care for Evelyn's roses. She had tended them every spring and fall for 22 years, and I had watched her do it 100 times without ever paying close enough attention. I was kneeling in the cold January dirt, her old gardening gloves loose on my hands, when I heard a car pull up that I wasn't expecting. The gloves were faded green canvas worn soft at the palms from decades of use. Evelyn's initial, a small embroidered E in blue thread, sat at the inside of the left wrist, stitched there years ago after she lost one glove at the community garden and decided not to let it happen again. They were a full size too large for me. My fingers didn't reach the empty canvas tips. I had been working around it, pressing them flat against the soil, and finding the work still got done only slower and with more attention required, which I had started to think was probably the right pace for this particular job. I heard the side gate latch. Brandon came through without calling out the way you move through a gate when you have already decided the property is partly yours to enter. He was in business clothes. Good slacks, a wool overcoat, shoes that had been shined recently enough to reflect even the thin gray light of January. They were picking up mud from the path along the fence before he had taken 10 steps. He scanned the yard with the same single organized sweep I had watched him perform in every room he entered. Those gutters on the east side are starting to pull away from the fascia, he said. Observed, not concerned. The difference was in the tone, flat informational, the voice of someone noting a deficiency in a structure they are in the process of evaluating. I know, I said. I have the materials. I'll get to it when the temperature holds above freezing for a full day. I kept both hands in the dirt. I was working the base of the third rose cane. Following notes I had found in Evelyn's brown notebook pages, she had written about which canes to preserve and which to cut, how far down to mulch before the last freeze, which sections of the fence got the most afternoon light. I was learning her garden the way I had once learned an unfamiliar building system, from documentation left by the person who understood it best long after they could explain it in person. The east fence needs attention too, Brandon said. I know that as well. He shifted his weight. His shoes settled another half-inch into the soft ground, and I thought briefly, without comment, that he had not dressed for where he had chosen to stand. Dad. A pause. Can I be straight with you, man to man? I set the trowel down and stood. I left both gloves on. Of course, I said. He met my eyes with more intention than he had at the funeral, more than at dinner last month. He was committing to this version of the conversation, the honest, direct version. He had thought through how it should look. It's sell the house. Take the equity and let me help you place it the right way. I have connections, people who manage exactly this kind of situation. You'd be taken care of properly, Dad. Not just getting by, properly set up. He said it with the cadence of a man delivering something he had been holding in reserve. This place is getting to be a lot for one person to manage alone. I looked at him. Connections, I said. I didn't frame it as a question. I was noting it. Sandra had used the same word at the dinner table 3 weeks ago, positioned in nearly the same place in the sentence. The same word passed between two people who had built the same argument and assigned different speakers to different parts of it. I had been watching for exactly this kind of seam, the place where the performance shows its construction, and here it was right in front of me. Don't wait too long on this, Dad. His voice dropped just enough to make it sound like wisdom. Markets shift. What the house is worth today isn't what it'll be worth if you hold on another year or two. You'd be leaving real value on the table. I picked up the trowel and crouched back to the rose base. I'll think about it, Brandon. He nodded once with a slight release of breath that meant he had filed my answer as something workable. He stayed another several minutes, walked the fence line. identified 2 more things that needed work, offered to get contractor referrals. He was thorough. He was in every way that mattered, behaving like someone already conducting an organized inventory of a property in transition. Before he left, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder. "I just want to make sure you're looked after," he said, his eyes resting on the fence rather than on me. Then the gate latch clicked. The car started, and the sound of the engine faded up the street. I stayed where I was in the cold dirt for a while after that. Markets shift. Don't wait too long. There was no concern of mine in those sentences. There was a clock 1 running against a deadline I hadn't been told about. Measured in intervals I couldn't yet see clearly. A man worried about his father uses different words. A man worried about his own situation uses those ones. February brought 2 phone calls. The first was an invitation to schedule what Brandon described as an estate planning consultation with a specialist from his firm, someone who worked specifically, he said, with people navigating post-spouse financial transitions. I told him I had my own legal counsel already in place. He paused, recalibrated smoothly, and said he completely understood. The second call came 11 days later. It opened as a check-in. Was the house holding up in the cold? Had I been eating well? Had I gotten out much? By the 3rd minute, without any apparent change in direction, we were discussing current asking prices on Clover Lane and whether I had given the house any further consideration. Each time I put the phone down after one of those calls, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, and I thought of the single word Evelyn had placed at the end of her letter, written in the same deliberate hand she used for things she meant to last. Watch. I was watching. And the thing I was watching was a man in a hurry. After the last February call, I put the green gloves on and went out in the cold to check the roses one more time before dark. I stood along the fence looking at the canes she had trained up the posts over years, each one still holding its shape under the winter cover she had taught me to lay down. Every living thing in this yard she had made live. She had chosen it, planted it, and protected it through the hard seasons until it could hold on through the cold on its own. I finished covering the roses just before dark. Standing there brushing the dirt off my knees, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon wasn't following any ordinary timeline. He was following his own one with a deadline I didn't know about yet. By March, I would begin to understand why. By March, I had been dizzy on and off for almost 3 weeks. I told myself it was grief that the body carries lost in ways the mind doesn't always recognize. But when the dizziness started happening in the mornings, before I'd even gotten out of bed, and when I caught myself on the towel bar one Tuesday morning, after nearly losing my footing on the bathroom floor, I called Dr. Abrams myself. He insisted I come in that week. The evening before my appointment, I was sorting through the mail at the front door when Dorothy appeared at the low fence between our properties, her reading glasses still on. The way she always came out between tasks without quite intending to stay. She had been Evelyn's neighbor for 23 years. She did not traffic in pleasantries. "You don't look well, Gerald," she said. "Are you sleeping?" "Well enough," I told her. She held her gaze on me for a moment in the direct, unsentimental manner she applied to everything, the way of someone who has lived long enough to consider politeness optional when honesty would serve better. Then she went back inside without further comment. I didn't make much of it at the time, but her question was still somewhere in the back of my mind the next morning when I reached for the phone, and I think it contributed more than I would have said to the fact that I actually made the call. Millhaven Medical Clinic sat on Crestwood Avenue 4 blocks from the hospital, where I had spent 34 years keeping the building functional. Dr. Abrams had been my physician for 15 of those years, a deliberate, careful man who read charts the way I read maintenance reports from the beginning, in sequence, without jumping ahead to conclusions he hadn't yet earned. He took my blood pressure in 2 positions, sitting 98/64, standing 89/58. He noted both numbers without expression and set down the cuff quietly. He asked about sleep appetite, whether the dizziness had any pattern in relation to time of day or posture. Then he asked the question I hadn't anticipated. Any supplements, herbal products, anything someone may have given you in the last couple of months. Osborne and Ontixtisspams. I sat on the examination table and thought. Sandra had visited twice in January. The first time she had come with a container of soup and a bag of groceries from a specialty store, which I had been grateful for. The second visit, she brought a warm Italian dish and a small paper bag that she set on the counter with a particular kind of deliberateness, slightly apart from the food, slightly foregrounded. The way you set something down when you want it to be noticed. In Senior Heart and Circulation Formula, she had said, lifting the white bottle with its green label. Cardiologists we know absolutely swear by it. All natural, completely safe. It's designed for men your age. She had mentioned cardiologists more than once. She returned in February with a second bottle, saying without being prompted that I should finish the first before starting on it. She had printed something out about the ingredients one page, which she set beside the bottle and never referred to it again. I told Dr. Abrams all of it. He opened his laptop, searched the product, and then turned the bottle I had brought along in my coat pocket. I wasn't certain why I had brought it, only that it had seemed as I was leaving, like the kind of thing to bring and read the back panel aloud. Hawthorn berry extract 1200 milligrams, garlic extract 600 milligrams. He set it flat on the desk between us. Mr. Sutton, both of these compounds are known to potentiate the blood pressure lowering effect of amlodipine. Hawthorn in particular interacts with the same vascular pathways as calcium channel blockers. At these concentrations combined with your prescription dose, the physiological result is consistent with exactly what you've been experiencing: morning dizziness, difficulty tolerating position, changes impaired postural response. The fall, I said, the fall is consistent with this profile as well. I want to be precise in how I document today. He turned to his keyboard. I'm recording the bathroom incident as a documented fall, noting the supplement interaction as the probable contributing factor, and entering the full ingredient list and the date of this examination into your permanent record. He looked at me clearly. Discontinue that supplement immediately. Do not take the second bottle. He continued talking, monitoring schedule, follow-up appointment, when to call, but I was attending to something else in my own mind. Sandra had specifically named cardiologists. Sandra, who had never offered anything without a considered purpose beneath it. 31 years in cardiac nursing had given Evelyn a pharmacological fluency that most physicians respected and most families never had occasion to see. She knew drug interactions the way I knew load tolerances, by training by experience, by the kind of knowledge that becomes instinctive after enough years. She would have recognized hawthorn berry extract and garlic extracts on a supplement label. She would have known precisely what they did to blood pressure in the presence of amlodipine. If Evelyn had known what Sandra had brought into this house, she would not have been surprised. I drove home on roads I had known for 30 years, in a silence that felt different from grief. Grief was heavy and inward and slow. This was something adjacent to cold, a heightened quality of attention, the way a building sounds different when you know where to listen for what's failing. I set the supplement bottle on the kitchen table. Then I went to the counter and opened the small tin box where Evelyn had kept tea bags and small miscellaneous things. And there at the back, still folded from the night I had found it in the nightstand drawer, was the slip of paper in her handwriting. Buy more honey, G, you always forget. I stood at the table and looked at both objects for a long time. The slip of paper and pencil worn at the fold, written by a woman who had spent 39 years paying attention to the small things that held a life together. And the supplement bottle, white and cheerful, with its green wellness label, carrying 1,200 milligrams of something that had been quietly making me lose my footing in my own bathroom. One from someone who had loved me carefully. One from someone who needed something from me. I did not call Brandon. I did not mention it to Dorothy. I did not look up the product online or read the clinical literature or do anything a person does when they are still deciding whether they have read a situation correctly. I had read it correctly. I sat in the kitchen in the late morning light and understood that I had been in a way that was still clarifying itself the object of something deliberate and patient. It was not anger I felt, not fear. It was the specific, settled coldness of a man who has spent decades locating the sources of failure in systems that look functional until they aren't, and who has just identified where the problem began. I called Thomas Hale. I called Thomas that afternoon. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence on the line, the silence of a man who has just confirmed something he had been hoping was wrong. Then he said, "Gerald, save that supplement bottle. Don't confront anyone. Don't change anything about your routine. I need 2 weeks." I asked him why 2 weeks. "Because," he said, "I think there's more here than just the supplements." Before I reveal what Thomas found, and I promise you, it is worse than the supplements I need to know you're still here with me. Drop the number 10 in the comments right now. Just that. It tells me you made it this far, and it means more than you know. One quick note before we continue this story. contains some fictional elements shaped to serve the telling and the message. Not every detail unfolded exactly this way, and if that changes things for you, this is a perfectly fine place to step away. But if you're staying, let's find out what Thomas found. 2 weeks after I called Thomas, he asked me to come to his office. He said he had found something. When I arrived, the files on his conference table were arranged in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that what he had found was worse than either of us had hoped. The offices of Hale Legal occupied the 3rd floor of Millhaven Commerce Center, a quiet suite with clean walls and the organized stillness of a place where attention is the primary resource. 3 folders lay open on the conference table, each set at a measured distance from the next. The documents inside aligned precisely. Thomas stood beside them rather than behind his desk. That choice told me something before he spoke. This was going to be a standing across the table conversation, the kind where what's on the surface between you is the point. He offered me a glass of water, which I accepted. He did not begin with small talk. "I want to walk you through what I've found in order," he said, "because the sequence matters." He opened the first folder. The supplement bottle sat sealed in a clear evidence bag I had given it to Thomas the afternoon I called, following his instructions to the letter. Beside it was a printed copy of Dr. Abrams' full clinical report, my blood pressure readings taken in 2 positions, the documented pharmacological interaction between hawthorn berry, extract, garlic extract, and amlodipine, a timeline of symptom onset correlating to the period of supplement use, and the bathroom fall recorded as a formal incident in my permanent medical file dated signed, and notated with the attending physician's clinical reasoning. "I've spent the past 2 weeks working with a colleague in criminal law," Thomas said. She reviewed everything in this folder. Under Indiana's elder abuse statutes, the exploitation provisions and the battery provisions, Sandra has legal exposure on 2 separate counts. The documented fall is the critical element. He set one finger on the physician's report. This is a signed medical record connecting a specific product given by a specific person to a specific physical injury. That is not an allegation that can be easily argued around. That is a record. He opened the second folder and placed a 2-page letter on the table, printed on the official letterhead of Millhaven Community Bank. "In January, after you signed the limited financial authorization, I contacted Millhaven Community Bank in my capacity as your authorized representative. I requested a review of any access attempts made on your accounts in the preceding 60 days. He pointed to the first paragraph of the letter. "On a specific date in January, which the bank has documented an individual who identified himself as a family member of Gerald Sutton, presented at a branch location, and requested account information. He did not have documented authorization. He did not have account holder consent. His request was denied per standard compliance procedures, and the bank logged the attempt according to their internal protocol." He slid the letter closer to me. "I want to be clear about what this is. This is a formal written record produced and signed by a financial institution. It was provided to you through your authorized representative, to whom the bank is legally permitted to disclose it. It is not our interpretation. It is not our conclusion. It is a bank document that exists and will continue to exist independent of anything else in this room." I read the letter twice. The language was considered and precise, the careful passive voice of an institution memorializing a procedural event, not accusation, which made it, I understood, considerably more powerful than accusation would have been. He opened the third folder. This required a search of Millhaven County court records, all of which are public. He laid a printout on the table. In the second week of January, before Evelyn's estate had been formally filed, before any probate process had opened, before Brandon had any recognized legal standing in her affairs, a firm called Hargrove and Bell filed a preliminary inquiry with the county court related to the estate of Evelyn Sutton. He paused, and the pause did its work. The filing was rejected at intake. Evelyn's estate passed through a revocable living trust, which does not enter probate and carries no open docket for inquiry challenge or contest. There was nothing for the court to act on, but the filing itself is a public record time-stamped, indexed, and searchable. Thomas tapped the case reference number. Brandon directed attorneys to take legal action against his mother's estate before he had standing to do so, on a timeline that only makes sense if he believed he already knew something about what that estate contained, a belief that, as best we can reconstruct it, originated in the summer of 2021, when he walked into a kitchen and saw something he was not meant to see. I looked at the 3 folders. Then I looked at the plain white wall behind Thomas and sat without speaking for what I estimate was close to 2 full minutes. 11 years. Sandra had spent 11 years in this family, at holiday tables in my kitchen, in the front pew at Evelyn's funeral, with her eyes appropriately downcast. Brandon had spent 39 years as my son. And in the second week of January, 2 weeks after his mother's burial, before the flowers on the memorial table had fully dried, he had instructed attorneys to move against her estate. He had begun organizing long before anyone had given him a reason. The cold came first. Not metaphorical and actual physical sensation, the kind that starts at the base of the neck. I had felt it once before, years ago, when I had opened a wall panel at the hospital and found the wiring not just incorrect, but deliberately bypassed someone covering something up rather than fixing it. The feeling now was the same. The recognition of an intentional failure dressed to look like circumstance. Then the steadiness came in behind it, the feeling I had carried into difficult rooms for 34 years. "Gerald," Thomas said quietly, "do you want to proceed?" "Evelyn asked me to wait 5 months," I said. "We're at month 3. We continue, but we document everything from here forward. Everything." He nodded once. Driving home, I thought about the second envelope, the one Thomas had kept sealed with his own name on the outside, only under certain circumstances. That was what Evelyn had said. Standing in my living room that evening, looking at her chair, I understood those circumstances for the first time. They were these ones. She had not built the trust, the legal structure, the sealed envelope and the 5-month instruction, because she was cautious by nature. She had built them because she had looked at the evidence in front of her and decided that evidence was going to require a response. She knew, didn't she? I said to the empty room. She prepared for even this. I sat in Evelyn's chair that night, the one with the slight dent in the cushion she'd left behind. I thought about 39 years of her watching, planning, protecting. She hadn't just left me money. She had left me a blueprint. The question was whether Brandon was going to give us everything we needed to use it. As it turned out, he was about to give us more than I had expected. April came slowly that year. The snow finally melted off Evelyn's rose bushes, and I could see the first green shoots pushing up through the dark soil, stubborn and small and certain. I had gone downtown that Wednesday morning for nothing more important than picking up a prescription refill. What I saw on the other side of the bank window stopped me cold. Brandon was inside Millhaven Community Bank. I recognized him immediately through the plate glass, the set of his shoulders, the particular forward lean he used when pressing a point, the way his hands moved when the conversation required something from the person across the table. He was at a desk near the back of the branch, across from a man in a bank uniform who was seated and listening, with the patient, careful expression of someone managing a customer who is unhappy about something they cannot change. A monitor sat on the desk between them. Brandon had not touched it. I was at the pharmacy 3 doors down. I did not move on. I stood at the pharmacy entrance for 25 minutes. I was not hiding. I was simply not in his line of sight, and I had no reason to change that. What I was doing, I suppose, was what Evelyn had asked me to do. I was watching. I thought about the words she had written at the bottom of the last page of her letter, and I stayed where I was. What I watched Brandon talking with his hands, the banker turning the monitor to face him, showing him something on the screen. Brandon studying it, then shaking his head slightly the way a person shakes their head when a number confirms what they had already feared. A short exchange, the conversation ending in the manner of conversations that have reached the end of what they can produce. Brandon came through the front doors with his phone already at his ear, turned up street, and walked directly past the pharmacy awning. He was perhaps 12 feet away. "There's nothing there," he said into the phone. "Barely anything. I don't know what I expected." He rounded the corner. He had not seen me. That afternoon I called Thomas and told him what I had witnessed, including the sentence I had caught at the door. He was quiet for a moment. "He wasn't conducting ordinary business," Thomas said. "He was looking for accounts he suspects exist but can't locate. He knows or believes that your wife's estate contains something more than any document he's managed to access. The trust account is held at an institution he can't identify, without authorization he doesn't have." A pause. "What you've described confirms what the Hargrove and Bell filing told us in January. He wasn't reacting to information he received after your wife passed. He was acting on something he had carried for years, going back to the afternoon he walked into that kitchen in 2021. To bring this forward clearly, we need to demonstrate the full arc of that timeline. We are in a position to do exactly that. We're not guessing anymore, Gerald. We're building a record. I set the phone down and sat at the table. The April light came through the kitchen window, at the angle it always had at this time of year, reaching the sill, touching the small clay pot with the succulent Evelyn had been patiently trying to revive. She had bought it at a plant sale for $3, certain it wasn't entirely dead yet. I had been watering it since January, the same way I had been leaving the kitchen light on when I went out sorting the mail into 2 careful piles, rinsing my cup and turning it upside down on the rack, keeping things the way she had kept them, muscle memory and something more deliberate than that, though I had not yet put a name to it. That night, well past midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, unhurried ones, the specific weight and cadence of someone barefoot on hardwood, moving toward the bathroom for water. The sound Evelyn had made so many nights of our marriage that I had stopped hearing it decades ago. I had not been sleeping well, but I was not afraid exactly. I lay without moving and listened. There was nothing, only the house and the dark and my own breathing. I knew what it was. The brain fills absence with the most familiar pattern it has stored. Grief works partly this way, the nervous system generating an expected signal after the source is gone. Because it has run that particular signal so many times, it does not immediately know to stop. I understood this clearly. The understanding helped very little. I sat up and turned on the lamp. Her side of the bed was as it had been every morning for 4 months. The pillow held its slight contour, the specific impression of someone who had slept there for 39 years. I placed my hand on it carefully, the way you rest your hand on something you are not yet ready to change. He was planning this before you were even gone, Evie, I said. Before the funeral flowers had even wilted. The room held its silence. I was getting used to that kind of conversation. By morning, I had made a decision. I called Thomas and told him it was time to start preparing in earnest. There were still 2 months left of Evelyn's 5 months. We were going to use every day of them. I just didn't know how far Brandon was willing to go until it arrived on my doorstep. The roses started coming back in late April, just as Evelyn always said they would. "You have to trust them, Gerald," she used to tell me every spring. "They know what they're doing, even when you don't." I was checking the mail when I heard the gate latch click and looked up to find Dorothy Klein standing at my front walk, with a manila folder under her arm and a look on her face that told me she had been waiting for this moment for a while. Dorothy Klein had lived next door for 23 years. I knew her the way you know a person who shares a fence line consistently, reliably, without occasion to test the depth of it. She was 71, with white hair cut close and practical, and she wore a green wool sweater despite the mild afternoon. 30 years teaching high school English had given her a particular way of speaking, unhurried, deliberate, with the patience of someone who has spent decades waiting for people to arrive at the right word, rather than accepting the first one that arrives. She was looking at the roses along the front fence when I came through the gate. "They're coming back," she said. "They are," I said. She turned to look at me then, and in her eyes, light gray, direct, very still, there was a grief I recognized immediately as genuine. Not borrowed from occasion, not performed for the moment, her own. "Gerald, do you have a few minutes? Evelyn asked me to come to you." She said I would know the time when the roses started coming back. She glanced once more at the young green leaves along the fence posts. "I believe the time is right." I held the door open. I made tea with the white china, set the one with the thin blue border. It was the only set I had used since December, and I had stopped thinking about why. I brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from Dorothy, who had taken the chair that had always been Evelyn's. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. Dorothy looked at the cups when I set them down. "She loved those cups," she said. "I know," I said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of 2 people who had loved the same woman in different registers, the silence that doesn't require filling, because what it contains is already understood. Dorothy placed the manila folder on the table and opened it with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something they have kept well. "Like 17 pages, she said. 4 months. I began in January when the pattern of visits became clear enough to document. The records were handwritten in the neat, slightly formal hand of a retired English teacher, dates in the left column, times in the next, then 3 to 4 lines of observation per entry. Vehicle description, duration, visible behavior, observed through the upstairs bedroom window that faced directly onto my front yard, Brandon's gray sedan, Sandra's black SUV. Arrival times that ranged from unannounced midday to a February evening that had lasted 40 minutes. Notes from 2 occasions when Brandon had been visible in the front yard, and one notation from the morning he had come through the side gate she had heard his voice from her window. She wrote and recognized the tone she was watching for. 9 photographs printed on standard copy paper, taken from the dark upstairs room with the window cracked open barely an inch. Brandon's car at the curb, Brandon standing at the side garden gate, his back to the fence looking at the roofline, Sandra walking toward the street with a bag over her arm. The photographs were not professional. They were clear enough. "I never went outside while they were here," Dorothy said. "I watched from the upstairs room with the light off and the window open just enough. People who are focused on a task rarely take stock of their surroundings. They're looking forward, not sideways." She said it the way she said most things, as plain observation, without heat attached to it. I turned through the pages slowly, seeing the months laid out in sequence: Brandon's first approach, the unannounced gate visit, the 2 February calls noted from overheard fragments while she was gardening at the fence gave everything I had experienced a different character. It looked like evidence, because it was. "Evelyn came to my door in June of last year," Dorothy said. 2 months after her diagnosis. She sat at my kitchen table the same way we're sitting now, and she said, "Dorothy, I need you to do something for me after I'm gone. I need you to watch. Write down who comes to Gerald's house and when and how they come. Not what they say inside, just what you can see. And when the roses come back in spring, take it to him." I set the folder down carefully. I asked her why she wouldn't tell you herself. Dorothy's hands rested flat and still on the table. She said, "Because if Gerald knows someone is watching over him, he'll spend his energy worrying about me worrying. I need him to move through this as himself. I need his responses to be real, not shaped by knowing I arrange for them." Dorothy paused. She was protecting the integrity of what she had put in motion. She needed you to arrive at each thing on your own. Outside the kitchen window, the late April light had gone low and gold. It reached the fence line and caught the young rose leaves at the edges, the way afternoon light catches things that are just beginning, translucent, tender, not yet finished becoming themselves. Evelyn had stood at this window hundreds of times watching that light move. Dorothy reached into the breast pocket of her sweater and placed a small envelope on the table. Her name was on the front in Evelyn's handwriting. Below it, in smaller, careful letters, "For Gerald, when the time comes." "She gave me this in September," Dorothy said quietly. Along with the folder she asked me to start keeping. She asked me not to read what was inside. I opened it. 4 sentences written in the deliberate version of her hand she used for things she intended to last. "If Dorothy is sitting across from you right now, it means you're nearly ready. Trust Thomas, trust yourself, and trust that everything I put in place was put there because you deserve to be protected the same way you protected me for 39 years without ever being asked." I read it twice. Then I set it on the table beside the cups. For a while neither of us said anything. "She really did think of everything," I said. It wasn't a question. Dorothy looked at me with those gray, clear eyes that had seen the better part of what they needed to see by now. "She had 8 months after the diagnosis, Gerald. She spent most of them thinking about you." We sat with that in the afternoon quiet of the kitchen. Dorothy stayed for tea. We sat with Evelyn's white and blue cups between us and talked about her for a long time, the real, her not the diminished version I had been carrying alone since December. When Dorothy finally left, I sat in the quiet kitchen and thought Evelyn had built something around me without me ever knowing it was there, and I was about to find out exactly how much I was going to need it. Brandon called that Friday afternoon, his voice carrying a specific kind of forced calm that I had come to recognize as the sound of a decision already made. He said he and Sandra wanted to stop by that evening to talk about some things. I said fine. I put the kettle on. I sat down in my chair, and I waited. Before they came, I lit a small candle on the fireplace mantel. It was something Evelyn had done on evenings when she wanted the room to feel inhabited, rather than merely occupied a single flame. The difference between a house with people in it and a house that simply happened to have people in it. The olive green tie was still on its hook beside the kitchen door, where I had put it after the funeral and never moved. I had stopped intending to leave it there. It had simply become part of the room. They arrived at 7. Brandon wore his work clothes, pressed slacks, dress shirt, the coat he used for client meetings. Either he had come directly from the office or he wanted to give that impression. Sandra carried a small leather notebook in her hand, already open, which she said on her knee when she sat down with the practiced ease of someone consulting a list they have reviewed more than once. She crossed her ankles. She was composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed the shape of the conversation. I offered tea. They declined. We sat. "Dad, there's something Sandra and I have been worried about for a while." Brandon leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the posture of a concerned son carefully rendered. "We've been talking about your cognitive health. Nothing alarming. Just some things we've noticed that we felt we had a responsibility to bring up." Sandra opened her notebook without hurry. "When I stopped by in February," she said, "you left the stove on when we moved into the living room. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want to embarrass you, but I noticed." She looked up. "And in January, there were a couple of moments where you seemed to lose the thread of the conversation, like you were somewhere else. It happened more than once." She closed the notebook gently, the way you close something that has done its job. I listened to all of it. I let the room have the silence that followed. Then I looked at Brandon and waited for him to continue. He reached into the folder on the coffee table and placed a document in front of me. Several pages stapled, typed on the letterhead of a firm I recognized, Hargrove and Bell. A draft durable power of attorney, signature line, blank no notary stamp. "We'd like you to sign this tonight," Brandon said. "We'll take it to a notary together afterward to make it official. This is for your protection, Dad, that's all. If something were to happen and you couldn't make decisions on your own, we need to be able to act on your behalf without losing time. This just puts that in place." I looked at the document. Then I looked up at my son. "What happens if I don't sign?" The pause before his answer was very brief and very deliberate. "If we genuinely believe there's a concern about your cognitive health, which we do, we'd have to petition the court for guardianship. It's a legal process and it takes time. It's public. It's expensive. It's stressful for everyone, but especially for the person at the center of it." He held eye contact with the careful neutrality of a man who has practiced this sentence. "We don't want that. We're trying to avoid that. But if you won't let us help you voluntarily, we may not have a choice." I understood precisely what he was not saying. The threshold for a successful guardianship petition in this state required a substantial showing, medical evidence, documented incidents, evaluations. A judge ultimately persuaded by clear and convincing proof. Brandon had none of what that required. What he had was Sandra's notebook and a doctor's record that told an entirely different story. He was not threatening me with success. He was threatening me with the process, the filings, the legal fees, the depositions, the family name in the county gazette, the months of attrition that could drain a man before anyone rendered a verdict. I thought about Brandon at 18. The afternoon the college acceptance letter arrived, he had run the 4 blocks between the mailbox and the front door. I had heard the porch steps before the knock. He came through the door and grabbed my forearms with both hands and stood there holding them, laughing with his whole face the way he had laughed in the doorway of that dressing room a decade later, before everything between us was transactional. "This is it, Dad," he had said. "This is everything. This is enough." The only time in my adult life he had reached for me with both hands and meant it without calculation. That boy was entirely real. The man sitting across from me now with his prepared document and his calibrated pauses had once been him. I had never quite been able to reconcile that. I suspected I never would. I did not touch the draft on the coffee table. The voice that came to me from the 4 pages I had carried in my coat pocket for months was Evelyn's, clear and unhurried, the handwriting deliberate. The words already memorized: "You are not small, Gerald. You never were." "I'll think about it," I said. It landed the way I had intended. Not as a refusal, not as an agreement, as something unreadable. Brandon had come prepared for 2 outcomes. Receiving neither, and finding no foothold in the quiet that followed my answer, he and Sandra stayed another 12 minutes, and then said their goodnights. I walked them to the door and closed it without watching them leave. I sat back down in my chair and looked at the document on the coffee table. The letterhead confirmed what I had suspected when I saw it: Hargrove and Bell. The same firm that had filed the court inquiry in January before the estate was filed, before they had standing. The attorney-client relationship between Brandon and that firm had been ongoing for months. Tonight had not been a sudden decision. Tonight was the conclusion of a plan begun before Evelyn was in the ground. I looked at the wedding photograph on the wall. 1985. The church on Carver Street. The 2 of us laughing at something just outside the frame. "Okay, Evie," I said. "I think we've seen enough. She had asked me to wait 5 months. Tomorrow would mark 4.5. I looked at the unsigned draft POA and understood with the clarity of someone who has been watching exactly for this, that she had prepared for precisely this escalation, that her blueprint included the moment when waiting and acting became the same thing. She would understand. She had built the structure for exactly this. I picked up the phone and called Thomas. "It's time," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. "I'll be ready," he said. Then a pause. "Gerald, there's one more thing I found last week, something that changes the picture in a way I think you need to hear before tomorrow." The next morning, I drove to Thomas's office before 8. He was already there when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the desk, the blinds half open. The files on his conference table were arranged with the precision of a man who had been working this specific case for a very long time and was finally ready to show everything at once. He handed me a coffee without ceremony and sat across from me. "Here is what I'm proposing," he said. "Tomorrow evening you call Brandon and tell him you've made a decision about the power of attorney, that you'd like him and Sandra to come by at 7. He paused. "What you don't tell him is that I'll be in the house before they arrive, and that Dorothy will be seated in the dining room with the door slightly open." "He'll see your car," I said. "I'll park 2 blocks east and walk. He won't know I'm inside until it no longer matters whether he knows or not." Thomas set both hands flat on the table. "I want him to say what he came there to say. I want the record to contain what he chooses to put in it, not what he might have chosen if he'd had more information." He moved to the question of recording. Indiana is a one-party consent state for audio recordings. Any participant in a conversation may legally record it without notifying the other parties. "I'll bring you a small device tonight, straightforward to operate, nothing conspicuous. Whatever is said in that room tomorrow will be legally admissible. I'll maintain the recording under proper chain of custody from the moment you hand it to me." He opened the folder and placed the first document, the supplement bottle in its evidence bag. Dr. Abrams' signed clinical report, blood pressure readings in 2 positions. The pharmacological interaction with amlodipine characterized in precise clinical language, the bathroom fall recorded as a formal incident, with date-attending physician's diagnosis and signature. A medical record that connected a physical injury to a product given by a specific person in that physician's own documented words. The bank's written confirmation letter, formal institutionally signed, dated stating that an individual identifying himself as Gerald Sutton's family member had sought account access without authorization and been turned away per standard compliance procedures, independent of anything Thomas or I had prepared, a bank document existing on its own. The Hargrove and Bell Court, filing from January, publicly searchable time, stamped to a week before anyone in this family had formal knowledge of what Evelyn's estate contained, evidence of prior suspicion, evidence of a plan running before its pretext existed. Dorothy's 17 pages methodical and dated, 9 photographs taken from a dark room, 4 months of a retired school teacher doing exactly what she had been asked to do, watching, writing down what she saw and trusting that it mattered. I read every page. Gerald Sutton, maintenance supervisor, the man who had fixed other people's broken systems for 34 years, sat in a lawyer's office on a Thursday morning and looked at what had been assembled on his behalf by people who believed he was worth assembling it for. "My colleague in criminal law has reviewed the totality of this," Thomas said. "Her assessment is that we have 2 separate legal tracks, civil and criminal, that each stand independently. The civil track requires no further work. The trust is sound, the POA draft is legally unenforceable. No challenge to the estate has standing. The criminal track is a matter for the district attorney. What I can tell you is that the pattern is documented. Individual incidents are arguable. A pattern of documented incidents across multiple months verified by independent third parties does not argue itself away." He placed both hands on the desk. "I've already filed reports with Adult Protective Services and with the Millhaven Police Department, before tonight, before tomorrow, so that nothing we do can be characterized as reactive or retaliatory. The reports exist in their systems. The record is established. What happens from this point forward is no longer within Brandon's ability to prevent by choosing a different approach." I looked at the window for a moment. Outside, Millhaven was doing what it always did on a Thursday morning in May, traffic in coffee shops and ordinary, life proceeding without reference to what was being arranged in a third-floor office on Commerce Center Drive. "What happens to them afterward?" I asked. Thomas was precise. For Sandra, Indiana's elder abuse statutes address both financial exploitation provisions and battery provisions. She has documented exposure on 2 counts. The medical record is the hinge. For Brandon, financial exploitation, the documented unauthorized banking attempt, potential fraud connected to the Hargrove and Bell filings, and the POA draft prepared before he had any legal standing. He paused. The DA will determine what charges to bring and in what form. But Gerald, even if they never enter a courtroom, even if the DA declines to charge, even if nothing criminal is ever filed, what happens tomorrow ends this, permanently. The trust passes to you cleanly. The documentation makes any future attempt legally inadvisable and personally catastrophic. That is already secured. Then we go, I said. That evening I sat at the kitchen table with the white and blue cups and made tea I barely tasted. The brown notebook sat on its shelf, returned to me in January. Standing in the same position, Evelyn had always kept it. The kitchen looked the way it had looked for 39 years. Same window light, same worn counter edge, same small things in their assigned places. I reached for the olive green tie. I carried it to the window above the sink. The glass was dark at that hour, giving back a faint image of the room and the man standing in it. I began the knot from memory the way Evelyn had done it in the dressing room in June of 2013, standing behind me, both hands working the silk with the ease of someone doing exactly what they intended. I tied it myself slowly and got it nearly right on the second attempt. I looked at the man in the dark glass. 61 years old, silver hair, the hands of a working man, worn at the knuckles, still capable, the olive green tie sitting where Evelyn's hands had placed it 11 years ago in one sense, and tonight in every sense that mattered now. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway before I went upstairs. 39 years of mornings at that table, the lamp above the stove, the chair where she had sat and written into the brown notebook page after careful page while I slept upstairs, believing she was documenting the day's patience. 31 years of that, all of it done in silence for the single purpose of making sure that when the time came, the truth would have somewhere solid to stand. The time had come, not because of the money, because truth kept in silence too long becomes a debt, and she had known that, and spent the last 8 months of her life making sure it would be paid on her terms. I went to bed early, and for the first time since December, I slept all the way through. In the morning, I got up, made 1 cup of tea, put on my suit, and knotted the olive green tie around my collar. Then I called Brandon and told him to come at 7. He said, "Does this mean you've made a decision, Dad?" I said, "Yes, I have. Before I take you inside that living room, before Brandon walks through the door and sees what's waiting for him, I need one thing from you. Comment the word ready below. If you've walked with Gerald through all of this, the funeral, the supplements, the bank, the power of attorney draft on the coffee table, then you've earned the right to be in that room tonight. A quick note: parts of this story include fictional elements woven in to deepen the experience and the message. Any resemblance to specific names or places is coincidental. If that's not the kind of story you signed up for, no judgment at all, this is your moment to step out. But if you're staying, what happens next is everything. They arrived at exactly 7 o'clock. Brandon always prided himself on punctuality, a sign of respect, he used to say. Standing at my front door in his charcoal suit, Sandra just behind him. He looked like a man who had already won. He hadn't looked at the living room yet. I stepped back to let them in. Thomas was in the chair beside the window, the one that sits at an angle to the door, positioned so that anyone entering the room meets it directly. He had been there since 6, and he had arranged himself with the stillness of a man who had nothing left to prepare. His briefcase sat closed at his feet. He looked at the door as it opened. Brandon saw him at the same moment he crossed the threshold. He stopped walking 1 step into the room, one hand still raised from closing the door. Something moved through his face in the space of a half-second calculation. Not surprise. A man running an inventory of what had changed and what that change required of him. "Who is this?" "Thomas Hale," I said. "Evelyn's estate attorney. Please sit down, Brandon." A pause in which he selected his response from the available options. He walked to the sofa and sat, and Sandra sat beside him with her hands already folded in her lap. They arranged themselves with the careful composure of 2 people who have been asked to sit and who understand that sitting is the opening move of something they did not script. "We didn't know you had a lawyer, Dad." Brandon's tone was measured, not hostile, calibrated to leave the door open to recovery, if the room could still be read. There are a few things you didn't know, I said. That is what tonight is for. I sat in my chair, the one directly facing the sofa with the fireplace and Evelyn's photograph behind me. The photograph from the last Christmas card, the one where she was looking at the camera with the slight tilt of her head, she always used when she was deciding whether to say something. I had started thinking of it as the one where she was paying attention. I did not begin loudly. I began the way she had always done difficult things by starting. On the 1st of January, I said, "Mr. Hale came to my house. Your mother left me his number in a note I found after the funeral. She had asked me to call him. He arrived 2 hours after I did." I looked at Brandon with the steadiness I had been practicing since December. He brought the brown notebook with him, the one you saw your mother writing in at our kitchen table. At evening after evening for years. The one she closed quickly when you came through the back door in the summer of 2021. Do you remember that afternoon? Brandon Ugisis Vestades Pstari Bamorov. His face held, but along his jaw at the hinge, a small muscle contracted once and released. I continued. In 1994, your mother inherited $74,000 from her uncle, a man who had spent 40 years working in manufacturing and left no one closer to pass it to. She was deciding what to do with $9,000 of it when I came home from the hospital one evening and told her about a group of engineers I had watched work that week. They were installing a record software system in the patient database department. They worked with a quality of focus and conviction I found worth mentioning. I told her at dinner and had forgotten it by the next morning. I held a pause. Your mother had not forgotten it. She purchased $9,000 of shares in that company the following month. The company was named Novatech Systems. Sandra had not moved from the position she had taken when she sat. Brandon was entirely still in a way that takes effort to maintain. Novatech went public in 2002. In the years that followed, as the company expanded its medical data infrastructure across regional hospital networks, the stock split 3 times in 2004, in 2008, and in 2012. The company was acquired by a larger healthcare conglomerate in 2018. Your mother's accumulated shares never sold. Not once in 31 years were converted to their cash equivalent and held in a trust account. I let that settle. 31 years of patience, Brandon, on the strength of something I said at dinner and forgot the same evening. I let a moment pass before I continued. Your mother established a revocable living trust. Everything she owned passed to me the moment she died, entirely outside of probate, instantaneously and completely. There is nothing to contest in any court, nothing to challenge in any filing, nothing to delay by any proceeding. The structure is sound, the transfer has already occurred, and there is no legal instrument available to alter that. There never was. Thomas reached into his briefcase and placed a single page on the coffee table. The asset summary, clean-typed, unambitious in its formatting. He slid it across the surface toward Brandon. I watched my son look down. He read it. He looked up at me. He looked back at the page. The number at the bottom was printed in the standard font of a legal document, precise, unhurried, making no argument for itself. $11,400,000. The color left his face by degrees, not the sudden evacuation of shock, but something slower, more interior. He had suspected for years that something of scale was there. He had built his entire posture of the last 5 months on that suspicion. The dinner, the unannounced visit, the phone calls, the POA draft, the bank. What he was experiencing now was not discovery. It was recognition, the particular quality of a man who has found what he was looking for and understood in the same instant exactly what finding it means for him. Your mother built that from a conversation at our kitchen table, I said, from something I said and forgot. She took 31 years every year of our marriage after 1994, and she turned patience and attention and quiet, careful work into that number, alone, without requesting acknowledgement, without ever taking credit for a single day of it. I looked at him without anger. I want to be clear about that. Not one molecule of what I was feeling was satisfaction. That was who she was. That was who sat across from you at every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday afternoon this family still had. That was who you never bothered to see. The room held its silence completely. The candle on the mantel gave one small, uncertain flicker, the first movement of air in what felt like a long time. Sandra's hands remained folded. She had been performing stillness since she sat down, and she was still performing it. Brandon placed the document flat on the coffee table. He placed it down slowly, not with control, but with the effort of someone containing something that control was barely managing to hold. He looked at me. For the first time since he had come through my front door, he had no prepared response. He had brought two versions of this conversation with him, one for a man who signed and one for a man who refused. He was looking at a third thing entirely. I held his gaze, not in triumph, not in anger, with the stillness of a man who had waited with a purpose and had arrived. I let the silence sit between us for a long moment. Then I said, "But the money is only part of what I wanted you to understand tonight, Brandon. Thomas, please continue." And Thomas reached into his briefcase. Thomas set his briefcase on the coffee table and began laying out documents in a sequence that felt almost surgical, each one placed with the precision of a man who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. He set the first document down and turned it to face Brandon and Sandra without comment, the supplement bottle in its evidence bag. Dr. Abrams' signed clinical report beside it, blood pressure readings taken in 2 positions. The documented pharmacological interaction between the supplement compounds and Gerald's prescribed amlodipine, the bathroom fall, recorded as a formal incident with date clinical diagnosis, and the attending physician's signature. The notes were in Abrams' own hand. The incident was in Gerald's permanent file. In January and February, Sandra brought Gerald 2 bottles of a supplement product while he was taking prescribed medication for blood pressure. Thomas said, "The hawthorn berry extract and garlic extract in those bottles are clinically documented to potentiate the effect of the amlodipine. The combination caused dizziness and contributing factors to a fall, all recorded by his physician in a signed medical report." He pointed to Sandra's name as it appeared in the intake notes. Under Indiana's elder abuse statutes, the provisions addressing physical harm and those addressing financial exploitation, Sandra has documented exposure on 2 separate counts. This is the physician's record, not our allegation. Sandra looked at the document. At her name printed in a doctor's clinical notation in a file that would exist independently of anything that happened in this room. The expression on her face was not surprise. It was the expression of someone doing a rapid and private accounting. She did not speak. Thomas placed the second document on the table. A formal written confirmation letter from Millhaven Community Bank provided to Gerald as account holder through his legally authorized representative. It states that, on a specific documented date in January, an individual who identified himself as Gerald Sutton's family member sought account information at a branch location without authorization and was denied per the bank's standard compliance procedures. Thomas set one finger briefly on the letterhead. "This is the bank's record, not our observation theirs, generated by their institution and provided through proper legal channels." Brandon's hands resting on his knees pressed slightly flatter. He held his posture with the careful effort of a man maintaining a position he was no longer certain of. Thomas set down the public court filing, the Hargrove and Bell inquiry from the 2nd week of January, time-stamped before the estate had been filed anywhere. Before Brandon had any recognized standing, rejected at intake by the county clerk because no probate docket existed to contest, a public record permanently indexed. You directed attorneys to file against your mother's estate before you had standing to do so, and before the estate had entered any legal process. The timeline indicates prior knowledge, tracing to a specific afternoon in 2021. That is what separates this from a family dispute. That is what makes it a pattern. He set the final folder down. Dorothy's 17 pages and 9 photographs. Brandon straightened slightly. Observing someone's property from next door is not... The bank's record is Brandon. Thomas said it without raising his voice by a single degree. The documented physical harm is, the court filing is, and Adult Protective Services and the Millhaven Police Department both received reports before tonight, filed before this meeting, not in response to it. Because that is my legal obligation as an officer of the court. What happens from here is not in my hands. A pause that had weight in it. Or yours. The dining room door opened. Dorothy came through it the way she did everything without announcement, without drama, at her own pace. She carried the original observation folder under one arm. She set it on the coffee table beside Thomas's stack, pulled a chair to my left, and sat without looking at Brandon or Sandra. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Brandon looked at her. He had passed this woman's house for 3 years without registering anything more than her presence on a street he believed he understood. In his expression for one unguarded second before he controlled it again, I saw the specific quality of a man understanding that he had miscounted the people in the room and had no idea for how long. Thomas reached into his briefcase and withdrew the second envelope. Cream paper, Evelyn's handwriting. His name on the front, the seal already opened. He had waited until now to read it aloud here, with everyone present with the recording running in my breast pocket. He removed the single page inside and read one paragraph in the quiet, careful voice of someone delivering something that had been trusted to them. Thomas, if you're reading this, protect him. He spent 34 years making sure the lights stayed on for everyone else. It's time someone made sure the lights stayed on for him. Nothing moved in the room. I was looking at Evelyn's photograph on the mantel, not at my son, not at Sandra, at the photograph where she was paying attention. She said I was not small, I said. The words came out quietly, more quietly than I intended. She said I never was. I paused. I'm starting to believe her. Then Brandon looked at Sandra. It lasted less than 2 seconds, a quick private exchange, the practiced signal of two people who have been running the same plan and need to recalibrate without speaking. It was the first time either of them had looked away from me or Thomas all evening. In that look, I saw clearly what I had known for some time. There was no grief in it, no fear for something loved. What passed between them was purely informational, the rapid, wordless communication of people deciding what comes next. People for whom this had always been from the beginning a matter of calculation. There had never been anything else. I stood up. It was time to finish this. I stood up slowly the way you stand when you've been sitting in one place for a very long time and your body has to remember how. I walked to the fireplace and stood with my back to it, facing them both. Behind me, Evelyn's photograph watched. I did not have notes. I had been carrying this for 5 months. I want to tell you what I know, I said. Not what Thomas has documented, what I know. In the order it happened. Brandon was still in his seat. Sandra had not moved since Dorothy walked into the room. Thomas and Dorothy sat without sound. Without motion, two people who understood that they were here as witnesses, and that the moment did not need anything from them yet. I began with the tie. The morning we buried your mother, I wore the tie she had knotted around my collar at your wedding 11 years before. I wore it because she had put it there, and she was gone. And it was the closest thing I had to bringing her with me. You told me it was inappropriate. You said it in a voice I had not heard from you before. Not a concerned voice, not an embarrassed voice. The voice of someone who had already decided what I was worth and found it inconvenient. Brandon said nothing. 3 weeks later, you called. The warmth in your voice was the constructed kind your mother described it to me once. She said it always preceded something. You invited me to dinner. Sandra told me cardiologists recommend a supplement product for senior heart health. You walked me through property values on Clover Lane. The word connections appeared twice in the same evening from 2 different mouths. I wrote that down in my mind. I continued. My voice did not change register. You came through my side gate on a Saturday morning, without calling ahead, wearing the suit you use for client presentations and shoes you'd shined. You walked the fence line. You pointed out the gutters and the east post and 2 other things that needed repair. The complete sweep of a man cataloging a property he is considering. You said markets change. Don't wait too long. I paused. That's not a sentence a worried son says to his father. That's a deadline. Then Sandra brought the supplements. I looked at her briefly, then returned to Brandon. 2 bottles, 2 separate visits. She set them on the counter apart from the food. The way you set things down that you want to be seen. She mentioned cardiologists as both times. She knew my medical history. Your mother was a cardiac nurse for 31 years and understood drug interactions the way I understood building systems by training by years, by instinct. Whoever chose that product chose it specifically. It was not coincidence. It was research. And then your attorney firm prepared a power of attorney draft and brought it to my living room. The same firm that filed a court inquiry against your mother's estate in the 2nd week of January, before I had told anyone what she left, before her estate had entered any legal process, before any document was public that would give you a reason to act, before she was a month in the ground. I let that sit for 2 full seconds. From the beginning to last night, every piece, in sequence, that is what I know. The room was very still. Brandon raised his head. We were worried about you, he said. No, I did not raise my voice. You were worried about what you thought I had. There is a significant difference between those 2 things. Your mother understood that difference better than anyone who has ever sat in this room, and she spent 31 years making sure that when the day came, the difference would be provable. A silence that took up space. "We're family," Brandon said. I stopped. Something moved through me, not anger which I had been prepared for. Something older and more difficult. I thought about a March afternoon on Clover Lane, running alongside a bicycle with my hand on the seat until I felt the balance hold and I let go before he knew I had. I thought about a hospital waiting room in the summer of 1993, his 7-year-old hand finding mine without either of us saying anything. I thought about the afternoon of the college letter, the footsteps on the porch boards, the way he came through the door without knocking both hands on my forearms, the open and unguarded face of an 18-year-old who had not yet settled into what he was becoming. This is enough. This is everything. I looked at the man across from me for those memories, and for the last time. "I know who you used to be," I said. It cost something to keep my voice level. I remember the boy who ran 4 blocks to tell his father he got into college, who held on with both hands, who meant it. I let the silence do some of the work. "I have been looking for that boy in you for a very long time, Brandon. I looked at every dinner table, every phone call, every conversation we've had in the last several years. He is not in this room." Something moved across Brandon's face, not remorse, but its geometric shadow. He pressed his palms to his thighs and stood. "You're going to die alone with all of it," he said. The client voice was gone. What was underneath was smaller and harder. "You know that." I looked at my son for the last time. "Goodbye, Brandon," I said. He went to the door without looking back. Sandra rose. She smoothed the front of her skirt with one automatic domestic gesture. She crossed the room, and at the threshold, she stopped and turned. She looked at me from across the full length of the living room, directly for 2 or 3 seconds, without apparent emotion in either direction. Not guilt, not defiance, not the face of someone defeated, or someone who has accepted defeat gracefully. An expression without color or feature. I could read the way a window looks when the light is behind you, and all you can see in it is your own face looking back. I have thought about that look since. I have no name for it. She left. I listened to their footsteps on the porch steps, the distant solid click of car doors, the engine turning over and moving away from the curb. Thomas and Dorothy remained in their places, quiet understanding that the room was not finished yet. I reached up and loosened the olive green tie from my collar. I worked the knot carefully, the same knot Evelyn had placed there in a dressing room mirror 11 years ago. The same silk. The same hands at both ends of the decade. I drew it free and held it in both hands for a moment, the way you hold something you are not sure you'll ever hold again. The way you hold something that was someone else's before it was yours. Then I folded it once and again with the deliberateness of a man putting something very carefully away in the right place, and slid it into the breast pocket of my jacket against my chest. I closed the door, and for the first time in years, maybe the first time since before Brandon had stopped being the boy I raised, I could breathe. Not the shallow breathing of a man waiting for the next blow. Real breathing. The kind Evelyn always said I forgot to do. I hadn't forgotten. I had just been waiting for the right moment to start again. In September, I flew to Ireland. I had never been on a plane alone before. Evelyn and I had always talked about going together someday. The way you talk about things you intend to do when you have more time. Standing at the gate at O'Hare with my boarding pass, I felt both halves of that truth at once. The sadness of going without her, and the quiet, stubborn joy of finally going at all. The summer had passed in the slow way I needed it to. For the first time since December, there was nothing to brace for, no call to evaluate, no visit to document, no pattern developing outside my kitchen window that required my attention. The house was simply the house again. I planted 2 new rose varieties along the south fence. I fixed the east fence post and the gutters and the 2 other things Brandon had identified on his private walkthrough, because they needed it, and that had always been the reason. I slept through the night. I placed 1 cup on the breakfast table and felt nothing complicated about it. It was simply morning. In July, Thomas called. Sandra entered a plea agreement with the DA's Office Financial Exploitation of a Vulnerable Adult and battery, both under Indiana's elder abuse statutes. 18 months suspended fines and restitution paid directly to you. He paused. Brandon wasn't criminally charged. The civil record stands and it's complete. But the DA determined the criminal threshold wasn't met beyond reasonable doubt on the account access charge alone. I understand, I said. Crestwood Capital initiated an internal compliance review after the bank's records became part of the case file. Brandon resigned before it concluded. State prosecutors are reviewing whether separate charges are supportable. His future in the industry is uncertain. I was looking at the rosebed. The pale pink one had taken to the fence well, and the hospital in Greene County, the reaching out you've been doing. They're very interested. 2 others have also made inquiries. Good, I said. I meant it more fully than most things I had said that year. County Clare on the western coast of Ireland, where the land ends in long shelves of rock and turf above the Atlantic. Evelyn had read about it in a novel one summer and described it with the particular enthusiasm she only used for things she genuinely intended to see. I want to see that Green Gerald, the green they always write about. You can't explain it from Indiana. She was right. The green along the cliff edges was something outside the range of anything in my experience, layered and lit from within, luminous even in the gray September light. I stood on the high path above the water, with the Atlantic wind coming in cold, and looked at the color she had wanted to see, and I looked long enough for both of us. I took photographs and sent them to Dorothy. That was the right amount. When I returned, I drove to Thomas's office and signed the founding documents for the Evelyn Sutton Memorial Fund scholarships for nursing students committed to working in rural Indiana hospitals. Structured to operate without an end date, administered with the hospital Thomas had been reaching out to, and 2 others expressing interest. Thomas set down his pen. She would have loved this. I thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table, with the brown notebook filling, page after page, in the years after 1994. About her sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table in June of 2024, 8 months before the end, still building things. She designed it, I said. I just signed the papers. October arrived in the quality of the light before anything else. One morning I sat with my tea and looked out at the garden. The roses had put out a last small cluster of late buds, pale, compact, determined to have one more round before the season ended. They know what they're doing, even when you don't. I know, I said quietly. I trust you. That afternoon, I drove to Millhaven Memorial Gardens. I had stopped along the county road south of town, where wildflowers grew along the fence posts every fall, the same pale, unremarkable flowers I had gathered from a roadside in the autumn of 1987. Newly married and without money for a florist. I had brought them to Evelyn, and she had put them in the small blue jar on the kitchen windowsill. She told me they were the most beautiful flowers she had ever received. She said it the way she always said things she meant, plainly, without embellishment, looking directly at me. I set the wildflowers at the base of the granite stone. I placed my hand on the surface, cool and smooth, her name, the dates. And below them, the line I had asked Thomas to have engraved when he asked me what I wanted it to say. She made the light stay on. The birch trees along the garden path had gone gold. The leaves came down in the unhurried way of things falling without wind to rush them. I stood in that stillness with my hand on the stone. You are not small, Gerald, I said, not to the stone. To myself, the way she had said it to me, as a fact, not a comfort, the way you say something to a person you know deeply enough to correct. You never were. Then, for the first time since the morning we buried her, I finally believe you. I turned and walked back along the path, through the gold and falling leaves. I did not look behind me. She was there, she had always been there, and I had learned at some cost. That presence does not need to be confirmed to be real. I walked to my car, got in, and sat for a moment in the October quiet of Millhaven Memorial Gardens. Then I started the engine and drove home to Clover Lane, to the house where we had lived for 39 years, to the kitchen where the white and blue cups sat waiting, to the rose garden she had left in my keeping. There was still so much to do, and for the first time in a very long time, I was glad of it. If you've stayed with this family story until now, you know it didn't begin with money. It began with a tie and 39 years of a woman who loved quietly and built well. I don't speak about God often, but I'll say this once: I believe He places the right people at the right table at the right time. Evelyn was mine. Dorothy was mine. Thomas was mine. That kind of grace only shows itself looking back. Here is my advice from someone who nearly let silence cost everything. Don't be like me. Don't watch a family betrayal take shape and tell yourself it isn't what it is. If someone treats your dignity like something they can repossess, act early. Truth doesn't grow stronger the longer you hold it alone. This family betrayal didn't destroy me because Evelyn refused to give it the materials it needed. That is my one regret. She built all of it while I was too trusting to see. My personal view, family betrayal, is rarely sudden. It is assembled quietly by people who have decided your worth belongs to them. The most powerful response is simply to refuse to agree. Every family story holds a lesson. This family story asked me who I was willing to be when no one was protecting me. I hope yours never asks the same. If this moved something in, you leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for staying to the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and education. If that's not for you today, choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.